Welcome everyone. My name is Naomi Schiller. I teach anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at Brooklyn College. And I just want to take a moment before we get started tonight to recognize that Brooklyn College sits on unceded territory stolen from the Canarsie and the Nyack, subgroups of the indigenous Lenape people. That ongoing theft, along with stolen blood and work of enslaved Africans, facilitates our presence. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and future who have stewarded this land. We recognize the hundreds of indigenous nations who continue to resist and uphold their sacred culture. We know that this acknowledgement is neither sufficient nor complete, but it is part of a process of learning to become more thoughtful and respectful. It is our wish for a deeper incorporation of Indigenous and Native American cultures, philosophies, and peoples into the curriculum, faculty, student body, and staff of Brooklyn College, in line with our mission to provide a transformative, distinctive education to the whole people of the great city of New York. So welcome, everyone. I'm just going to begin with some introductions. So we have a wonderful panel tonight. Tonight's panel is called Countering Colonialism in the Classroom. And our esteemed guests include Lawrence Johnson. Professor Johnson is a sociologist who explores discourses of racism, particularly in relation to Black elected officials. At Brooklyn College, Professor Johnson teaches courses that explore sports, Black masculinity, and colonial frameworks, among other topics. Victoria Stone-Cadena is a sociocultural anthropologist who studies indigeneity, ethnicity, and transnationalism. She teaches about gender, race, and ethnicity among Latinos and in Latin America. She is associate director at the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at the Graduate Center. And Winona LaDuke, who maybe needs no introduction at this point, but for those of you who are just joining us for the first time this week, Winona LaDuke is a rural development economist and author working on issues of indigenous economics, food, and energy policy. She lives and works on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota and is executive director of Honor the Earth. So we gather tonight to think collectively about what it means to teach and learn about colonialism at Brooklyn College and beyond. I'm part of Brooklyn College's Anti-Racist Coalition, and one of our focuses this year is to develop an understanding of what anti-racist pedagogy or education means and looks like at Brooklyn College. Central to anti-racist pedagogy is creating a campus that affirms the lives and presence of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And foundational to this is our ability to understand and teach about colonialism. So I think Professor King will drop some information about upcoming events of the Anti-Racist Coalition, but I'm so excited to be part of this event tonight and talk about what it means to decolonize our classrooms. So I thought I'd start with just a few questions, and we're going to open it up in about 20 minutes, but we'll start with a round of discussion among our fantastic panelists. So I wanted to start with just sort of a broad question of how do you define colonialism for your students? Professor Johnson and Professor Stone-Cadena and Winona LaDuke, what are some of the terms that we need to understand together to have a shared understanding of our language, to have this conversation? And I don't know how many students are here tonight, but I always find it really helpful to sort of center the conversation with a little bit of personal reflection of like, when was the first time that you understood what colonialism meant? Not just like in an abstract way, a definition from a textbook or a book, but in your own life as part of your lived experience. So I just wanted to start there. I'm happy to open it up. I don't know who wants to jump in first. I'll just invite you. Go ahead, Victoria, please.
I think you to go first because you kind of like get it all out. I think I also just want to add like one other hat that I've kind of worn different hats. So I've worn a hat as an administrator at a center, as a researcher, and now I'm teaching some classes at St. Peter's University in Jersey City. So I'm glad I have some kind of like very fresh material to work with to reflect on my teaching pedagogies and how we talk about it. So I'm teaching around Latin America, the Americas, Las Americas. And I think the beginning is to kind of like deconstruct how they understand geography and space and that narrative. And start from the assumption, I think we were talking this a little bit before, is that these students are coming in with a very colonial frame of how they understand the history of the United States. So we're in conversation with that, like how do we deconstruct this and how do they understand, you know, encounters? In terms of language, I try the conquistadors, right? I take issue with the terminology. First of all, because it implies that a people were conquered when there are people still living in these communities still alive with us who can speak for themselves. And so I find also using the endeavor as active verbs. So being engaged with using these active, there are perpetrators and there are people who are experiencing things. It's not enslaved, not using the passive voice for this process. And so I think through some of those ways, modeling how we start to kind of deconstruct it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'll jump in because it really comes down to personal experience, how one starts to develop an understanding of colonialism. I think about Black Skin, White Mask by Frantz Fanon, which is probably one of the seminal texts that people read about colonialism. And he talks about how one might not encounter what he's talking about as long as they're in Martinique. But the moment Frantz Fanon goes to France, he's now very aware of his colonial upbringing. And I think about my own experience leaving Chicago and then going to undergraduate at Iowa State. And I had a whole world thrust upon me that made me rethink everything that I thought I knew and understood about myself, but also about the world. So in terms of defining colonialism, I try not to get too big on a definition, but help students understand the role of domination, which is essentially what colonialism is, the role of domination in their life, whether they feel it from one perspective or one position or another. So what does it look like in the mind of a Brooklyn College student or experience of a Brooklyn College student? And that's what I'm still trying to figure out. So not, confronting them with this broad definition that to me explains the world, but starting with themselves, because I start, of course, with this idea of thinking about the sociological imagination. There's always this idea, how do we make the most average things, the most ordinary things appear strange? And when we know that there's all these instances of domination in our everyday lives, how do we proceed with ideas like democracy and rights and all these different things that they've been forced to regurgitate, even though their experiences are often different? So that's how I approach it. So they learn about colonialism from these macro processes, but also examining the things in their very lives as people who live in Brooklyn, who live in New York. So when we have names like Canarsie or whatever, they have to question these things. It's not just a name, but this is something that's part of their history that they're living out.
Thanks so much, Lawrence. Winona, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. So there's a native scholar, his name is Steve Newcomb. He's a Shawnee, a Western Shawnee scholar. And he writes a lot about the Doctrine of Discovery, which is kind of the foundational documents for how you actualize colonialism, where you say that, some people are in charge and it comes out of papal law. And if you discover other people, then you get to claim their lands if, and them, if they're not Christian. And so, his work is around this, the damaging nature of the Doctrine of Discovery in political and legal thinking as it has been applied for 500 years, which is very significant. I mean, because, that it describes how you get settler colonialism justified and European colonialism justified through this process of, the church and saying that some people are Christian and the rest of them are not. And they need that, and so there is that, so one thing he said I've listened to him many times, but about 25 years ago, I heard him talk about colonialism, and he said, the root of the word colonialism? He said it's colon, kind of like digesting. So he said, it's kind of like the political, the economic, the religious, the military, you know, the social digestion of one nation by another. You know, and I never really forgot that. And you know, so it's kind of this idea of what the practice is of colonialism, which is basically you're digested by somebody else. You know, so I've always acknowledged, you know, that when I learned it. And I remember as a young woman, I think it was my first year at Harvard, and for some reason, you know, I'm 61. And so, you know, when I was a kid, they talk about in social studies class, the Indian problem, you know, be the Indian problem. Like, what do you do with the Indians, or the Indians have a problem, was kind of this like thing that they put on you, like there was a problem with you, you know, and you know, you could never kind of sort it out as a kid. What was the Indian problem? And then when I grew up and went off to college, which is where you get all kinds of more critical thinking, of course, is I remember that, you know, I remember getting politicized with the American Indian movement and meeting the, you know, the Palestinians, and meeting the, you know, African National Congress at the United Nations, and the Namibia, the Southwestern African Peoples, you know, organizations. And I was like, looks like this is a worldwide problem, you know, of colonialism and indigenous peoples. And so there's like this moment that occurred when I was like 18, where I was like, well, there's no such thing as an Indian problem. You know, it's this problem of colonialism, how it's exacting its lives, you know, around the globe. And so, you know, that's kind of my moment of when I understood that, you know, I became, you know, I was, you know, no longer the problem. And I realized the problem was these nation states and this capitalist system that, you know, or, you know, imperialist system, whatever it was, that has exacted our lives.
Can you all talk a little bit about how you teach your teaching practice, and you know, if it's specific texts or moments or anything that you feel like works, that you return to, what is core in your teaching about colonialism? Lawrence, you want to kick us off this time?
Sure. Actually, let me share an image really quick, or I guess a PowerPoint slide. So it could be somewhat visual, because, you know, I teach a sports course, and this is my widest audience because it's a general elective. Can everyone see this? Mm-hmm. Okay, but, you know, there are just basic things that we understand about, you know, how we consume sports. We know that football or soccer is the #1 sport in the world. So, you know, I ask basic questions. Why is most of the world primarily playing football? And the US is different. The green represents, you know, worldwide soccer or football. And of course, the blue represents American football or Canadian football, then red, other sports. But the whole world plays soccer. We have to ask the basic question: how did soccer become, you know, dominant in the world? Why is the US distinct? And I do things like problematize names and ideas that they see every day. So it's not just, you know, the Washington football team that's controversial, but what is controversial about the San Francisco 49ers, the Philadelphia 76ers, the New York Rangers, right? These are all terms that are, you know, problematic. So when I look at, you know, these teams that they're all familiar with, is the UMass Minuteman, you know, something to celebrate, or is it something to critically dissect? So that's what I do with sports. And of course, they thinking that they're going to talk about who's better, LeBron James or Michael Jordan, but they end up finding out that, no, we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson, right? And how when we think about Andrew Jackson in the War of New Orleans, there's an entire mythology surrounding this where we get the idea of the volunteer. And I always challenge students to think about what scene in American culture rivals, you know, the scene at the Saturday afternoon, 100,000 people in a packed college stadium, right? What comes close to this, right? We talk about a ritual of the past, where people are celebrating notions of, you know, American triumph and everything else. And I want them to think about this and understand that this is not something that happened in the past, but it's something that plays out in our everyday life. So, you know, connecting settler colonialism from the past to the present, to we're looking at, you know, 2 soldiers in Iraq flying a volunteer Tennessee flag. And it becomes a conversation about how do we understand, you know, Andrew Jackson, Jackson democracy, and then of course, how we understand our own political participation today. So my approach, let me stop the screen share if I can. So my approach is to really engage them in the everyday things that they are familiar with in terms of sports. So I asked the question first day of class, whoever signed the biggest recent paycheck, you know, in past years it was Clayton Kershaw, he signed for, you know, however many dollars. This year it's Patrick Mahomes for the Kansas City Chiefs, another mascot name, but he just signed a $500 million contract. And I always ask them, is he paid adequately? Is he paid enough? Is he overpaid? And I use those conversations and discussions to talk about how the very process of slavery, which is a part of the, you know, broader project of colonialism, this sets the idea of value for us to understand how we talk about human beings as commodities and what exploitation and pay and dehumanization all entail. It's a very broad conversation, but the goal throughout the semester is to introduce basic concepts that they're familiar with, and then really just try to, as Frantz Fanon would say, you know, introduce a level of violence in terms of reshaping how they think about, you know, the world, their place in it, and the everyday, you know, structures and mechanisms. So that's how I approach it. I can share a syllabus for a theory course, for a sports course, an intro course, where I've tried to, you know, implement, you know, a decolonized framework for each course, but it really becomes a practice of imagination. I invite my students to have imagination, and I often tell them that, you know, I'm experimenting as well, because, you know, colonialism is a reality that we want to insert into a discourse that oftentimes is excluded. So there's no single way, but I practice it in all of my courses. But I think sports is probably the easiest, but also most difficult, because one, sports is super exploitive and it's always been a part of the Imperial Project, which I explain in the course. But also, students come in wanting to talk about sports, and they might be very resistant to anything that has anything to do with Andrew Jackson.
So I want to kind of go off of that. My age group, I mean, I do obviously give college lectures, but I don't usually, you know, I can talk about indigenous, you know, colonialism of indigenous people for sure. But I, you know, during this time and previously, I've homeschooled a lot of kids, and you know, here on the reservation, and so I taught history through pirates. You know, it's a great way to teach teenage boys or 10-year-old boys history through pirates. And then the question is, like, pirates really got a bad rap, but they're certainly glorified. But like, who was the real thief, right? You know, they were robbing the Spanish ships, and you know, so where did that come from? You know, and so you could certainly, through the history of piracy, teach a great course in colonialism and how some people get rich and get, you know, become Sir Francis Drake. Right? And then some people get hung, you know, and then who had the riches and how they were redistributed, and, you know, and so from, you know, there's, I really like the football too. I might have to borrow some of those slides because I got a bunch of boys again. You know, but you know, there's so many ways to teach about it. And so that's been largely, you know, my practice for, you know, global colonialism and world history.
So I'm still, you know, I'm 4 weeks in, I guess, and I'm dusting off the cobwebs on my teaching chops because I haven't been in classes. I've been doing more like events and kind of community events, and dusting off my chops in a Zoom environment, which is, you know, its own challenge, right? So I've kind of rethought this pedagogy in this context, right? So, you know, even from, let's see, what are some of my practices to talk about it? I mean, I teach Latin American studies, so I mean, it's
Right.
prime to kind of engage in this. What is the Americas? What are these experiences? And I often just look at my syllabus and really try to center and amplify the scholars, Indigenous scholars, Black scholars, people of color scholars, women, international scholars, just kind of like vet out these kinds of historical narratives that we have, these textbooks that they come more familiar with, that the authority is a male figure, that the authority is, you know, just trying to like at that kind of rooted base level to really just put my syllabus together that way. But using this environment where it's much more dependent on it, you can have like the visual tools that we might be able to use to engage our students. I have been using a lot of primary voices and performances and activists. So we'll read through a kind of a textbook or some kind of, you know, talking about segregation. And, you know, there's the academies that's pervasive within that. And then we talk about that a little bit. And then countering that with, what I think is one of the advantages of being an anthropology professor is like how people make meaning despite these circumstances, and finding authors and literary figures. So for example, we read about gentrification, and then we listened to a reading of James Baldwin's letters to my, my nephew, James, from a text. And so like countering, like kind of finding it, shifting the balance of whose voices are narrating these specific histories, I guess. And so trying to find practices to do that a bit in this environment that's engaging students, because this is also a challenge right now. But, you know, by centering certain authors, revamping whose voices are being amplified in my class, I guess would be my short answer to this.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think picking up those threads and looking at the great comments and questions in the chat, you know, one thing that I was hoping we would talk a little bit about is like, what does it mean to decolonize our classrooms? And particularly, as Patrick notes in the chat, you know, many of the relationships that we are in are, you know, hierarchies of power to begin with on so many levels, right? So, and the students that we often get at Brooklyn College, but elsewhere, you know, education has been for them their entire lives an experience really of domination and dispossession in many ways, and or alienation, right? And so, how do we think about? I mean, we hear the term decolonization a lot, right? So, you know, on the one hand, I'm asking you, like, what does this term mean to you? How should we think about it? And also, how do we decolonize our pedagogy, our classroom, the classroom space, which is now the Zoom space for most of us?
I like I think it's Rebecca's question, you know, because I find that maps are a really good way to decolonize, because they're, you know, everybody has a different story of where they live and what it is. And, you know, GIS is a very colonial system. You know, I had this interesting, you know, because I've been fighting this pipeline project for 7 years, and I put our maps and their pipeline up, you know, in my last day of the hearing. I was like, well, this is our world and this is their world. You know, I mean, because there's an assumption, you know, which was the whole argument in the environmental impact statement process, which is like a federal and state regulatory process, that the GIS system was the correct system. And I was like, well, it's not the correct system, because it doesn't really reflect the Anishinaabe world. I mean, I live in a world where half of the world is water. And so my world is not the same thing as is viewed in a GIS map. There's like beings in the water. There's things that, you know, are just totally omitted in that. And so I often start with maps. And, you know, a lot of times, and particularly in the West Coast, I could have brought this up, but there's like these maps of people that refer to themselves as the upriver and the downriver people, you know, which is a totally different view than they might be called, of course, like all our own names. But, you know, so when they draw a map, they put themselves the uprivers to the top of the paper, and the downrivers at the bottom of the paper. Well, it turns out that the geographic orientation would have actually been east-west. But people have their own way, and I think that maps are such an excellent way of telling your narrative. And so that's just kind of foundationally how I often begin that. And then another thing that I do is, and which I'm sure that you all do, is, I mean, because I have all kind of experience with a lot of, I live in a really conservative area up here. Oh my gosh, so conservative. So many Trump signs up here. It just makes you want to weep at their stupidity. So you're dealing with these multiracial school districts full of kids that have been ingrained with this, racism by their parents. I mean, it is like soup, it's spat up here, and so you go in the school district, and I remember this time I went in the school district and that's right, they had taught Indian history that week or something, and they had these people, and some were called the Woodlands Indians and some were called the Plains Indians, and and I was like, well, who are those people? I mean, I was like, I don't say, oh, the Plains Indians are coming to eat tonight. I mean, it's like all this like made up geography. And last night I was listening to this workshop and this guy was talking about the Paleo Indians. I was like, well, am I a paleo? Or, it's like all this terminology of colonialism and characterization that is like carried out in the categorization of colonialism in education systems. So I spent a lot of time like deconstructing, but I remember this moment when I went into this school and, of course I had to bring the goods with me, but I was like, try these words. The words are like chocolate, avocado, tomato and potato. I was like, try those words. And they were like, all looking at me. I was like, yeah, those are all Nahuatl words. They're from northern Mexico, and all that food that been like, consuming, it has this history, and it's a part of these trades and colonialism and an erasure, like who knew that? So there's a lot of ways, to teach, obviously, and you guys are all teachers, but I depend on the age group, and sometimes, those kids got a lot of chocolate, so they remembered me forever.
I'll jump in. One of the ways I always start, I have to make it personal with me as the instructor, but also they have to, become invested in some of the goals of the course. So one of the things I do, which is part of a project that they have to do early in the semester, but also demonstrate an understanding of colonialism late in the semester by doing a writing assignment in which they find their family history, something about their personal narrative in relation to colonialism. I often use my last name, which is Johnson, which I have no particular affinity for, but I did come to find out that, Johnson is merely a name my grandfather adopted. And this is a story I share in class. My grandfather adopted the last name Johnson when he moved from Louisiana to Chicago, which takes you through a whole winding road of, before his name was Johnson, it was John Veer. And before John Veer, it was something totally lost, given the circumstances of history and the ways in which slavery is a part of the larger project. So I explain this and I say, how do I feel about my name? How do you feel about your name? How do you feel about different things that you can connect to directly? And when we start with something very personal, we can start to understand that the things that are very personal to us actually is a part of a larger, national and even global picture. And that's what we try to connect throughout the semester, depending on what the course is. But it's something as simple as that. They have to interrogate themselves. And I think that, for me, is how I started thinking about colonialism. That's how I connected colonialism to slavery and everything else. And you often have, say, for example, the white male student who does not understand his role in participation in colonialism. And we have reading materials where they understand that there are groups of settlers who came to the US legitimately looking for an American dream, whatever it means. And they were exploited, disenfranchised, and they were used to be, quote, Indian killers or enslavers themselves. So none of this is disconnected. And once they, are challenged with connecting their narrative to someone who they see as, very different from them, I see it as my job as the instructor to help them make those connections. And if we make those meaningful connections, then the instruction, it works. I don't think those connections can be made in the standard narratives where we talk about American exceptionalism, rights, democracy, et cetera, because those things, those real experiences get lost in the mainstream narrative. So I think they start to make those connections, the light bulb comes on, and they genuinely get excited.
I'd love to stay just for one more moment on like the difficulties that come out, the hard moments in the classroom that we face with a range of students who struggle with some of the material that we're teaching for a lot of different reasons. Would any of you like to comment on like how you navigate difficult moments? I think, Lawrence, you just highlighted a really beautiful way of thinking about complicity, but also the complexity, you know, in terms of responsibility over time. But others or more from you, Lawrence?
Well, I'll say you get maybe the 1 or 2 students this semester who will say something like, you know, the Indians lost, get over it. You know, it's our country now. And I find those students who are that level of acerbic, they actually galvanize more interest. So I actually welcome the problem student because it's not so much that I'm focused on changing his or her mind, but they're a teaching tool for everyone else. So if they make the absurd argument, I want to take time with their argument, not dismiss it, but I want to invite other people to contribute to their argument to see how much support can we build for that argument. And then honestly, I want to tear it down in the most sound way possible that emphasizes this is the I mean, because we're talking about a question of reality, right? We're challenging students' sense of how the world operates. So I think it is going to be some tension. It's going to be some, you know, resistance. And I think developing mechanisms against resistance, I think it comes with the practice. But the great opportunity when teaching about colonialism is that most students don't know enough about history. So in bringing history forward for them, you actually get a level of appreciation. And the people who have some sense of history, they tend to challenge you with the easy argument that you can debunk, I think, or at least, you know, have students think critically about and further engage. So I use teaching tools like Slack to, you know, extend conversations and open up dialogue and have students who were quiet in class to, you know, add on, engage further. And ultimately we keep those discourses going because it's not like that problem student on day 3 is no longer a problem student on day 100. We want to keep them engaged, and if they make the absurd statements, then we engage that as a teaching tool for everyone else.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think thinking of it as a teaching moment certainly is a good perspective. No. I think we have, you know, I'm teaching at a Hispanic Serving Institute, so there's a lot more diversity in the classrooms than we might find in other spaces. So I think what, I don't know if it's necessarily I'm going to address the difficult moment, but it's also the kind of empowerment of our teaching that provides history to our students that I find really invigorating. And that there's this moment where you talked about the light bulb going on over their head. That is so, like, I think I finally hit it last week with my students. And it was like, I was like, yes, this is why I teach, because there's this aha moment of seeing themselves in a world that's just shifted in its paradigm and their location in that world, and getting a sense of a bigger history and a connectivity to other folks around the world who have had similar experiences, or their family experiences is connected across different spaces, right? So thinking about the Americas, and I love the idea of using maps in the classroom. I do one activity where I have them draw maps of their communities, but highlighting places of significance. And so it becomes totally distorted in terms of the maps we see on GIS in terms of how geography is laid out, the dimensions and dimensionality of these significant spaces. And then we kind of rethink, like, you know, what are some assumptions that we have, relationships of space to place. But I feel I'm trying to, like, I know that I've had a few problems, like students who come up with the question that is, it's uncomfortable because it's so uninformed or misinformed. And so taking that as a teaching moment to kind of engage them in breaking it down. And I think there's a modeling. I do have one, like, intolerance that I know could be up for dispute, but I kind of lay it out for them in the beginning of class that, like, we don't use the term illegal in our class. And if they wanted to kind of have a conversation and bring, you know, like with me, but in the classroom setting, to understand that as a discriminatory term, and that we'll just reframe that and we'll explain it. So I kind of use terminology at the beginning, like they might kind of get a little perplexed with me, but we work through the class. So it's almost like a challenge, posing a challenge for them conceptually up front, and then kind of revisiting that. So it might be the same with colonization, right? Like how we take that as a certain set of assumptions of how that played out, and then, you know, revisiting that over time and rethinking, like, what do you understand differently? What are perspectives that are different? But I really love this idea of maps and mapping and space and, like, where we are in that space.
Winona, do you want to jump in, or you're good? Okay. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
No, I'm content. I'm
Okay,
content.
great.
I was just listening. That's all. I'm all on the same team. That's all good.
Great. So, I mean, I know we want to open it up to more conversation, especially with so many incredible colleagues who are joining us tonight. I think I had one last question that I wanted to ask Winona about. I wanted to ask you about what you think about the practice of land acknowledgements as a teaching tool, and how you've seen them sort of develop over your lifetime and your career. I'd love to learn your perspective on that.
Yeah, I am really proud of the transition to having these, and then having you begin that. It's kind of like, it's a decolonization process. And having institution after institution slowly begin to kind of disassemble the mythology about particularly land grant institutions, because those land grant institutions were all granted our land, and so I was like, we should be talking about that a little bit more, so I think it's a beginning. And then, I've always been raised with the understanding that the only compensation for land is land. And so you have a land acknowledgement. Well, that means at a certain point, we should be talking about what land restoration looks like, and so there was a really great case I think it was last Thanksgiving, but in the city of Eureka, California, they returned an island called Indian Island, to the Wiyot people there. And it was a good thing that they did that. And I was like, yeah, and I wrote a little essay about it, but I was like, yeah, they kill all those people. It was like really brutal. And then they held on to it, and then finally they give it back to those people. I was like, wow, 150 years later, but you are seeing this in the land back movement, where you have, for instance, the Black Hills illegally taken, held all this time. Federal, state, and county governments, largest landowners, my own reservation, a third of the land is held by the federal, state, and county governments. All these national parks should be managed by Native people, we should be in charge of all that business, because we actually know how to take care of them. They're all annexed. Blackfeet, Glacier Park, annexed. So, I think it's the beginning of a dialogue, but what, restorative justice looks like is you start returning land. That's what justice looks like, not just a land acknowledgement, but, and you got to start somewhere and then get over your fears, because the largest landowner in the country is the federal government and the military. They should just start forking some stuff over, because, we need to be done with that business, and then you see this larger conversation happening. And, I'm seeing of large absentee landowners, descendants of mining corporations, wanting to talk about land restoration. So having it begin with this acknowledgement, which has been such amount of erasure where people don't even know who's from there, right? It starts something that, is feeding and nurturing. And now I'm beginning to see, at a level that I hadn't seen in my life. Broad sweat. I mean, people calling me up and saying, I want to return some land. I'm like, whoa, okay, let me help you. Let me help you find them people.
Yeah. So I want to open it up now, and I'm suggesting that we use the chat. I find it the easiest way to keep track of things. So if people want to write stack in the chat, if you have a question, and we might start with some of the previous questions or return as people are thinking. So Rosamond, did you want to jump in with those questions, or should I?
I think Patrick Sabongui, who just posted a question. I think.
Oh, great. Patrick?
Sorry, you want me to actually?
Yeah, you just voice it.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing your thoughts, everyone. This is very informative. I had two questions that were kicking around. And the most recent question I asked, do you have thoughts on, in the classroom, what to do if BIPOC students are resistant to the instruction from white faculty because they haven't yet developed that trust across the racial and the authoritarian divide, even if the faculty is trying to introduce a decolonized curriculum, even though obviously the institution is not there yet, but how to navigate that resistance?
I'll jump in on that, maybe from a slightly different position, but obviously being Black. But I often find a different type of resistance from Black students, primarily because when I teach a course, about race and ethnicity course, for example, it's often a position or a posture that I already know what I need to know about race, because so much of their experience has been one in which they've had to deal with racism. But I often have to, target them in ways too, to say that, one's experience of racism is simply that, an experience. And what we're trying to do is develop a larger understanding, not just of our experiences, but how our experiences relate to everyone else. So from that standpoint, even throughout graduate school, where I had white peers taking Africana studies courses, there was a tentativeness about their position in the program and in the structure and the teaching and everything else. But I always, encourage them to actually, one, own their experiences and things that they have not experienced, but also to connect their experiences to the same structures of domination that everyone else can relate to. And I don't know, what goes into that process, but for the non-Black person or the non-person of color, but ultimately I think where colleagues have had success is that they know their shit. And I think that's what has to be conveyed. It's not this, I'm going to be tentative with the BIPOC student, but here is the agenda, here is the goals, and this is what I'm challenging you with. And I think to the degree that you are able to push, I think some level of respect can be earned or, transmitted.
I'll jump in. I'm very open about my identity in class, like being comfortable speaking about race and racial differences. It kind of sets a tone in the class, like find your own comfort zone, work on it. And I'll talk about being, I'm Puerto Rican, Latina, but I'm also very white. And that allows me, talk about privilege, what that means for me, and acknowledging those spaces that I have access to, identifying how I see myself as maybe an ally, but also kind of an interloper, right? In different spaces where people have expectations that me being white will have some kind of affinity of perspectives. But also that there's constant work, that kind of, this is not work that's done, that you all of a sudden get to this stage because we're all, I think, embedded in these systems. And it's continually kind of being drilled down in different ways. And just, I guess what Naomi was saying, like that kind of power structure in the classroom is being willing to relinquish some of that by just positioning yourself as a space.
Welcome to macOS. Voiceover is on.
So just a question of like being open to saying, there's still work to be done on myself, and this is a constant lifelong project, but positioning yourself and being very open about it and being comfortable positioning yourself.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a lot of to say on that. I've raised a lot of Native youth and seen them react to not, white teachers. And, usually, I don't know. But what is that I see that you can earn their respect and, know your stuff. And then, yeah, that's really it. And it's so circumstantial. And, I've worked in partnership with a lot of allies, and they earn my respect, and that's how change is made,
We actually have more comments than questions in the chat, which is great, and I'm trying to keep a resource list. But we do have our colleague Swapna Banerjee who wanted to share some thoughts, and not to put her on the spot, but our colleague Laura Tessman is here from theater, and I know that they went through a whole retreat over the summer addressing these issues, so she might also want to share some thoughts.
So do I go? Rosamund? Okay. Hi. Thank you for an excellent talk and very, very thought-provoking conversations. So I am a historian of colonial India, and all my courses, several of them cross-listed, are on colonialism. So what Lawrence and Victoria and Winona have been pointing out are all true. So I also start my classes with maps first, just to familiarize my students, with the landscape and the global domain of colonialism. So I ask my students, the first class or the second class, we always start with defining colonialism, and most of the times they respond by saying it's a political and economic domination of one group over another. But what I try to tell them through the rest of the semester is that colonialism is also a conquest of the mind. So that's where we go back to Fanon and others. That's how I introduce them. So though it's not always a political and economic domination as we understand it, but it's also the conquest of the mind and how it's intricately connected with capitalism. And I also try to show the counterflow of colonialism and what really sticks with them towards the end. I have not really found resistant students, whatever color or ethnic background thereof. But when they initially start, when we talk about the definitional problem of colonialism, I start out with different thinkers, starting from Schumpeter and Lenin to Gandhi, and we end with Du Bois. And what my students find out, because Gandhi argues that it was not them, but you who made them the king, the dominant, actors who were able to conquer you, who were able to colonize you. So that I found profoundly effective, because that's something that sticks with them, that it's us. So it's the subordinated population, how we internalized the forces of domination and carry it on. So kind of, I'm referring to Lawrence's points. So that's what I wanted to share. And, I can go on and on because that's my, bread and butter. But there are many ways that students come around and develop a wider understanding, because we end up with, of course, settler colonialism and non-settler colonialism. We talk about in Native Americans, particularly I bring in the example of the Carlisle School, and almost they become eye-openers to them that such things occurred around the corners. So, and how we could decolonize them. So we talk about sports and music. I try to connect them to their own lives, and they work. At the end, they are happy to learn something new. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swapna. So I guess we're more of a comment than a question kind of crew tonight. So if other people have comments, please. But I wanted to actually return to my question about what does it mean to decolonize. I mean, I think Winona spoke to like if we're talking about land acknowledgements, you need to return some land, that these needs to be material commitments. But I was wondering if we could flesh that out a little bit more, because I think, I have a lot of students who, or at least in the upper level classes, who like to talk about decolonization. And it can be challenging to really wrap our heads around what that looks like.
Well, I consider that we're in a state of affluenza, which is a product of a lot of colonialism, a lot of, accumulation of being this first world country that consumes a third of the world's resources at everybody else's expense, pretty much, right? And so how do you start deconstructing affluenza? That's kind of the question that we got to ask ourselves, because it's so pervasive. I refer to it as Wendigo economics, or the economics of cannibalism. And our participation in it is pretty significant. And so, on one hand, there's like the individual decolonizing yourself. So what do you eat? Why do you eat it? Those kinds of things, which, even in the enlightened, vegetarian, cool people, like, how far should that stuff travel to get to, Whole Foods? Where did it come from? So there's these issues of fair trade, and then also carbon footprint. Those are all like in our food system. And then sometimes I have this conversation with myself. After the revolution, can I still have red Jello? I don't know. How do you know what I'm saying? Is like, there's all these like super colonial foods, but sometimes I'm like, I like red Jello. I know it's horrible, but I like red Jello. Like these kind of things, like, which are like real conversations, like what's what. And then there's like the issues of trade in food, like, because it's not like you only eat local food, but what's the terms of the trade of that food? And how does that work out? So I work a lot on food. And then you work on, and then to me, then you look at issues like energy, like the colonialism of energy systems. Like, I come from communities, or I've worked most of my life with communities who produced America's energy. If energy colonization is anything, it's the 42, uranium mines, 10 uranium mills, 5 coal-fired power plants, and 4 coal strip mines on the Navajo reservation in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's colonialism. That's energy colonialism. And, so there's this like regional impact of that, of, how we choose to live and how we are accountable or not accountable for that which feeds this world of affluenza that we've decided to live in. And then you take things like decolonizing your stuff. Like, how much stuff do y'all need? We've developed a society that's like full of gadgets, full of stuff, full of stuff that we store, that we have security systems to protect, and like all this stuff, which is, a whole part of this whole, colonial paradigm of accumulation, which is a lot to do with empire. Like how much, we don't need all that stuff. Let's just be honest. And so I think that there are those like very personal decolonizing your stuff. And then we could get to language. That's all, important too. I hate it when people tell me that they're gonna, I got a lot of pet peeves, but there's like, we're gonna create a pipeline for jobs. I'm like, we ain't gonna create a pipeline, okay? There's all this terminology of America. I want to do a couple more things. Like one of the things another really thing that bothers me, I have this long list of pet peeves. But like the Midwest, what the hell is the Midwest? That's like a geographical, doesn't make any sense thing, The mid of what West? It's like this, I don't know what it is. But I don't live in the Midwest, I live in the Great Lakes. So don't tell me I'm the Midwest. I'm in northern Minnesota. This is lake country, but kind of like deconstructing the terminology that is like so widespread. And then of course I love to do things like let's just reclaim the names of those places. Think about it. Cecil Rhodes, Mr. Rhodesia. And then like Queen Charlotte Island. Like who the hell was Queen Charlotte? Like, how'd she get that giant island in British Columbia? It's called Haida Gwaii. That's where the Haidas live, and they lived there for 10,000 years. You know, so I think this indigenous geography decolonization of like all these mountains named after white guys, you know, so to me, that's like a really important process, which is, you know, underway on a worldwide scale. They don't call it Rhodesia anymore, do they? You know, they don't call that rock Ayers Rock in Australia anymore. That's like Uluru. That's what they call it. You know, so to me, that's a really, really important part of like giving places back what they're supposed to be. And decolonizing the names, you know. And then last time I was in New York, I went to Astor Place. You know, y'all been to Astor Place, I'm sure. And I was like looking up there at the beavers. Well, you know, does anybody talk about like beavers and colonialism? I mean, you know, the history of building this country on the backs of beavers, John Astor, you know, I mean, there's a beaver there at Astor Place. That's what one of the, you know, a friend of mine showed me. I was like, wow, yeah, that was the, you know, the American Fur Company, right? You know, so these things that, you know, in the Empire State that y'all got out there, you know, how'd that all get named, right? You know, so I think that there's this opportunity to kind of like deconstruct all of the naming mythology that is associated with that I try, you know, of course, I think it's, I'm so happy every time I see another name come back, or they take down those names. And then of course, there was the fabulous early summer of the statues falling. Oh my God, was that like the best decolonizing thing you ever saw? I never thought all those Columbus statues were gonna fall. And it was like a week, they're all down. You know, way to go, people. You know, so if they won't decolonize themselves, apparently we gotta help them decolonize or something, you know? But I was like, you know, so these opportunities are there, and I keep referring to this momentum of these social movements, of this multiple crises that we are in, as really this opportunity, as Aaron Dottie Roy speaks of to go through that portal without carrying all that stuff with you. You know, we don't want to carry all this colonialism and hatred and punitive justice systems and, you know, dirty skies and dirty politicians. We want to move on. You know, so your opportunity is right there in front of you. Change things, because things are changing right now. And you either got to decide if you're going to let them guys change for you. Change is inevitable. It's a question of who controls the change. We want to be the ones changing, you know? That's how you decolonize. You just do it, you know? That's my thinking.
Lawrence, I think you're up.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I also want to add to the idea that one of the things that really challenged me and continues to challenge me is the very assumptions we make about what it means to be human, right? And I think to have certain experiences forces you to think about it, you know, more intensely. But what it means to be human is something that I also try to trouble in terms of our thinking, because it's often these evasive manners of maneuvers where it's like, you know, there is no races, you know, it's just the human race. But still, we have to question, what does it mean to be human? One piece that I share in my theory class especially is Sylvia Wynter, No Humans Involved, a designation that, you know, the LAPD used to use for, you know, urban Black and Latinx youth who were seen as non-human because they didn't have any form of productive input in terms of economic position in LA County. And then it's this question of what makes someone human. Sylvia Wynter argues that our basic concept is biological and economic. And when we actually think about what humans are, in various cultures across the world, it was never this reduction to something so violent as economic and biological, but there's always been this understanding of complexity rooted in cosmology stories that gave a human being some type of idea of thinking about themselves in a larger totality. And I think whenever I hear this evasive maneuver of we're all humans, you know, I believe every human should be respected. Under what conditions, right? How does that convey to your position on the earth in terms of climate change and things that you consume and your relation to animals and everything else? So I think there's always this way of being challenging to students, but it's also a manner in which you have to be challenging of yourself, right? So I think the very concept of what it means to be human is something that I'm always exploring. I'm always ready for that. We're all human beings, red, yellow, black, white. Is like, tell me about that red, yellow, black, green human, and what are the assumptions you make about that person, because that might be part of the colonial project.
Thank you, Lawrence. Jocelyn, I'm going to ask you to jump in here and share what you're thinking. You've dropped that in the chat, and I would love to hear a little bit more about your reflections on that. Professor Wills. Oh, sorry to put you on.
It's okay. I thought Laura was up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I miss you there? I apologize.
Well, that's okay. Such great conversation and many things to share. I will be brief. We are in the Department of Theater, deep in the process and have much to go in terms of thinking about decolonizing the curriculum. But we felt this summer that it was urgent that we start rethinking our history of theater courses. And demand, sort of from demands of the students, especially. It was something we knew we needed to do anyway, but became more urgent because of that. And just a couple of the things that we started with, our first step was to rethink the idea of chronological history in those classes and allow the sort of natural, create for the professors to begin to create themes around issues that they felt were important of import that they wanted to look at, and that then allows them to kind of structure the course around a larger question, a thematic question, that then they can pull source material that is from a variety of different places, and sort of decentering that white voice, that European-centric history that we've all been taught and that we now teach as well. It's a challenge for our, for all of us to step back and really do that work in a class where it's sort of a survey kind of class, and to seek out the different voices. I loved the comment earlier about positioning different voices against one another, and so we really we met as a team, those of us teaching it as well as those who kind of have some experience to offer, and we all shared different. Somebody would say, "Oh, I don't know much about this area," and we would glom on and share resources and talk about particular ideas based on what the instructor was working, the ideas that they were working on. We have a long ways to go in across the curriculum. It's something that I realize that I have done in my own teaching for 20 some years, probably because of my early positionality, looking for stories of women in history of theater. But I am realizing more and more that it is our responsibility to collaborate as colleagues in the department to move that agenda forward actively, and to be open with one another and sharing resources, as well as sharing challenges that are coming up. And I think that all of us have been very galvanized by that early process, and there's much more to do.
Thank you so much, Laura. Yeah, I think that this work can be really challenging, and it's not easy. And I think it's not always, to talk about how do we decolonize our curriculum. I know that that's work that we're beginning to do in the Department of Anthropology, and over basic things like course names, like we have a course named race, right? And maybe we should rename that and call it racism, and you know, things like that. I mean, and there are a lot, and it's not even when people are very well-meaning. There are differences different perspectives we have. And I think actually when things get difficult, that means we're doing the right thing. We're really in the right place, right? When things get challenging.
I would love to come back to my colleague, Professor Patrick Sabangui's question earlier about, because one of the challenges that we are facing is that we have students who really want to be involved in this process and sort of understanding how to involve. You know, I don't know if anyone has experience of involving students in the actual process of, you know, the redevelopment or changing of curriculum versus us kind of, you know, doing what we typically have done, which is try to fix it, you know, try to do our best to acknowledge and make changes as you were mentioning, Naomi. So I don't know if anyone has any experiences or ideas to share on that front. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Jocelyn, do you want to chime in?
Just briefly, before I say anything though, sorry, just a sec. I just want to thank Winona and everybody else who has participated this week so far, and we're only halfway there. This has been such an energizing experience for so many of us, so I really appreciate it. So I had written something about what constitutes a successful life, and everything that's been said so far this week really reinforces that: capitalism, war, empire. I'm teaching American Dream and Reality, which is my favorite course because I get students from all across campus taking this course because they want to know the secrets to success. And I guess the real challenge is us all, including me, and students have helped me do this too, is rethinking what constitutes a successful life. One is that isn't about cannibal capitalism, which I so love, I'm going to steal it from you. But that's, I think, for many of our students, one of the hardest bridges for them to cross. And ourselves too, we always want to trot out somebody who's one of the exceptional few that we say, here's a Brooklyn College alum who's had a successful life. Well, what do we mean by that? And Winona being here really does make me realize how important it is that we bring students back, or alumni back, who lead extraordinarily ordinary lives of purpose, where they're doing something important and it isn't focused on material gain. Because that's what students who come to my class are hoping for. And I have to say, Zoom has been challenging in so many ways, but the community that's developing in my class, because students are talking to each other about it, and they're rethinking their future in light of COVID. So we have a real opportunity to not only try to help them understand things that are expertise, but we have so much to learn from them, and our students know struggle more than anybody else on this, you know, in this city for sure. They're the working poor for the most part, and they understand these things. And so I think we have an opportunity. And Winona, I'm so grateful to you that you're with us this week, because it really has helped a lot of us open up these conversations in different ways. So thank you.
You know, thanks for having me again. I've really enjoyed it too, because it gets to, like, I think about things that, you know, obviously I don't talk about with the 14-year-olds too much. You know, but, you know, it's like the whole range and the work we do here. But, you know, I you know, a lot of times I think, you know, because I have a liberal arts education and everything, and I was like, so what do we teach people? You know, by the time they get out, I mean, we're all really smart, but we can't do anything. You know, I don't really know how to put it, but, like, you know, they can't grow anything. They don't know how to sew. They don't know how to fix anything. You know, they don't know how to, you know, cook. they can reheat or order food. I mean, and so I don't want to be, judgmental, because I want the critical thinking of a liberal arts education, but I also want people to actually be able to do something. And, we're raising a generation. I mean, I got a bunch of entitled kids around. You don't want to hear the conversations I have sometimes, my hand on my hip, but I'm just like, what y'all thinking? What y'all thinking? And I think that we need to actually think about that, because there's something about this idea. Like, I used to spend a lot of time, like, people, think about the white collar versus the blue collar or the t-shirt, So what in what world do we value, this scholar more than this farmer? Or in my community, like, I worked with this guy, he was here earlier, Ronnie Chilton, he barely got through high school. But he's like the smartest guy I know, and he knows how to process wild rice. He knows the nuance. He knows what, so that's indigenous traditional knowledge, not valued at all, in academia, but he's, and so to me, there's this whole, like, and he fixes shit, like anything, he'll like look at this giant puzzle and he'll figure out how to build this like equipment out of this giant piece of, oh, let me get this piece of this, and, so my point is that, we want to encourage people to actually, be able to do stuff too. And because it's such a first world privilege to be able to, be the person who orders Chinese food, or whatever. It's like, that's super first world privilege stuff. And this is all fossil fuel privilege that we're in right now. I was on a little rant here. I'm about releasing my essay on redemption, because I was watching this call out culture. And, there's this like big argument about people that I know, and, and people like, say this stuff, but you don't need the lecture on that. But I'm like, so I don't know, like in 4 months, it's going to be minus 20 degrees here. So I feel like I probably don't have time to do that stuff. I got to figure out, like, how do you survive at minus 20? That's actually like kind of a real thing for me. This conversation which I have with my sons or my grandsons, I'm like, so, what's it going to be like? It's going to be cold or what? But my point is like, how do we reaffirm whole beings too, and also recognize like the privilege, the first world privilege, fossil fuels privilege that we have, and then also kind of deconstruct that privileging, because that privileging assumes like other people are going to take care of all your stuff. And if you just got a credit card, you're good, and I think that that's like some crazy thing. And I know I'm talking to a bunch of people in New York, and so it's a little bit different world than I'm in, but, I know that you understand what I'm saying. And to me, that's also part of, what we need to do is value, value many things. And then also, what a horrible situation that, our education institutions are facing like now, but also like, I'm a big fan of the trade schools. I'm a big fan of them, but where are they training renewable energy? Where are they training in sustainable farming? How do we teach these things that in academia in a way that also, you have some hands-on skills? I think about that, there's a lot of, different pieces, but I'm sorry, because I know that you're in Brooklyn, and so like a lot of that stuff is probably not something you're going to do right away. But the how you teach about it, and to me is also important, because it is kind of decolonizing education out of the privilege of the academia, to be, something that is also do something with your education that makes a difference. Mm-hmm. Change the world with that education you got.
Yeah, maybe we can reflect for a minute. I'd love to hear other thoughts about like what success looks like for our students. Like how can part of decolonizing our classroom mean rethinking, as Jocelyn was also suggesting, what success looks like. While you were talking, Winona, I was thinking about many of our students at Brooklyn College come from Kingsbury Community College. And one thing that is happening at Kingsborough is that they have united with, I'm going to get the name, it's not a pipeline company, but it's an energy company where they're teaching students, there's a big program to teach students to work at call centers. And that's the kind of like training that is happening for many of those are the options, you know, that is being presented for many of our students. And so that's the kind of background, you know, when you're talking that comes up for me, and the challenges that we face in negotiating the kinds of deals that are being made and the futures that are offered for many of our students. But Lawrence, Victoria, in terms of success, or others, anyone, like how do we work to, as Jocelyn and Winona are encouraging us to think about reframing success for our students, what it means to have a good and fulfilling life, and especially in these really challenging moments?
I'll tie that question to something Jocelyn just said about regenerative education. A big part of what we're challenged with in sociology, in anthropology, in English or Pearls or Africana studies is these courses are not valuable because they don't equate to some type of, you know, direct economic gain that they might associate with business or physics or some other discipline. And I think, you know, if we could really conceptualize, you know, transforming pedagogy at Brooklyn College, it would be something where the business student understands the inherent value in knowing history and the inherent value of knowing that language is a generative thing in our everyday interactions that we need to think critically about. And I think to the point, until we get to that point where we have that cross-curriculum regenerative education, we're going to keep finding students from business or elsewhere coming into a sociology class saying this is all common sense, right? So one, we're in a materialist culture that devalues everything else. So we have to turn Brooklyn College into some type of an incubator that's very different from everything else they're learning, because it's on TV, it's on their smartphones, it's, you know, the reason why they're at Brooklyn College. So it has to be something that's disrupted in the very process of being at Brooklyn College. I think that's a lofty goal, but, you know, curriculum is probably the best place to start. And I think that's probably why ARC has been pressing, you know, pedagogy, you know, front and center at this moment.
I'm just going to jump in and say, you know, speaking about the students, and I know both CUNY students well, because I've been at CUNY, but also some of the thinking through some of the parallels here at this university in St. Peter's. And it's a similar population, like knowing the context that they're coming out of, like they're individuals, but they're also parts of families and networks. And they're positioned in their dynamic and choices and constellations are part of these broader families and communities that they're a part of. So it quickly becomes like, what tools do we give these students to not only kind of be and live a full life, but also how to kind of contend with the pressure to go into business school, because they're the first generation of students who are going to school. And so it's not just a testament to themselves as individuals, but their family's legacy, the sacrifices that their families made to migrate and work and put them through school. And so there's this big onus on them to kind of perform as a part of the family. And so I always tell them, you know, like, if you get into these, like, I'm giving you the tools to have a really great conversation at your family dinner, right? Like, if you want to kind of have a conversation and you want to dismantle some of the ideas, like maybe some of your elders or your cousins are coming to the table with, and you want to kind of challenge them, you're going to have the tools. That's what this class is going to provide you with. And thinking about the world in a different way, and kind of putting on new glasses in a way that you're going to see and understand. And I think that helps them navigate in the world in a different way, which is really meaningful. But, you know, I think it's always difficult, especially with this population, is like knowing their economic but also their kind of familial connections and locations in the city. You know, it's a pretty overwhelming task. And so I think I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Victoria. I think Ria Rahman had a question. See you on Stack, Ria.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everyone. This has been an incredible conversation. I wanted to ask about, this has been asked and sort of said in different ways, and it's related to, like, you know, who we all know are, you know, not that our CUNY student population is homogenous, but right, we have, like, as Jocelyn said, like working poor, working class, students of color. And Naomi, Professor Schiller, you had said earlier too, you know, a challenge that we might have with students is coming from educational backgrounds in public schools. I think for myself, I'm really thinking a lot about discipline, like the education system as like disciplining our students. And something I'm, you know, I wasn't teaching last semester, but I am now, and I'm finding myself frustrated with students that are asking, you know, really like micromanage types of questions. Like I said, find something off the internet, like, well, can I use this site or can I? And so I was thinking like, oh, you know, Winona, you were saying earlier about like liberal arts college to like teach critical thinking, something I struggle with. And I think this is related to, right, like I need to just get a job, like get something in business, right? Like what is the, I think Victoria, how you were saying like that actually this is really important for your lives in these other ways that students might not engage. But all of this to say is I'm thinking a lot about the ways that the education system is so disciplinary, and how, you know, in imagining a successful life, and especially in the ways that COVID, all of these like social inequalities that are exacerbated, the move to technology and the increasing surveillance and therefore increasing disciplining of students. So these things that we've been seeing about of like test, these things that like track students' eyeballs to like when they're taking an online test and things like that. So my question was to think about if people have like thoughts or ideas of pushing back against that. I know Arundhati Roy also, and I believe in the portal talk, you know, talks about like we used to be sleepwalking and now we're like head on running into this like digital surveillance state. So the question broadly is like digital surveillance, like in our context as teachers, but also pushing back against, you know, in terms of thinking of like education as liberation, against discipline, and even thinking of like how do we talk to our colleagues that might also want to be reinforcing these very like disciplinary modes of education. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, thank you so much, Ria. So we have about 5 minutes, so just let's be mindful of we're closing out with maybe some final thoughts about how we push back against the disciplining force of education and the surveillance state. In 5 minutes, go. Jocelyn, you privately messaged me that you might have something to say. Do you want to say something?
Just very quickly, I haven't graded for 15 years. We focus on education, not on the grade. I have to, and we talk about how that has to happen at the end of the semester. But it was hard the first semester, but I have found, and students can come to me asking for a grade on demand in the middle of the semester. But I've found that if they don't have the pressure of the grade, and they're also allowed to do journal entries on what they're reading, where they can be free to just stream of consciousness if they want, as long as they're learning and engaging. They do actually get more, I think, I hope, out of the class than if they're pressured by the grade. And some students are uncomfortable with it, but they come and talk to me in office hours, and I explain in class and during the office why. And I think it shifts the dynamic of our project together, that we're all learning from each other rather than I'm there and I'm going to grade their worth. And some students are very insightful, but their writing isn't that great. So they can come and we can talk about how to put stuff together. But I just want to say that's important. And then they also don't feel surveilled as much.
Well, I certainly think it's easy to push back right now. The systems are like in total disarray, you know, so I feel like just go for it. You know, I mean, I'm just sitting here and I'm like, okay, so I got, you know, I'm looking around here and these school, I mean, you know, all these rural schools, nobody knows what to do. You know, and so I believe that some ones have to have some coherence. That's what I think. You know, someone's got to have an idea, and instead of like wringing their hands, you know, like what's the idea? So I'm doing basically, they used to have survival schools in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s in our communities, indigenous survival schools. And I'm running a new survival school, You know, I mean, obviously I'm in a different situation than y'all, but at the same time, I feel like, you know, there's always opportunities, and now is a big one, you know, to transform how we're all transforming how we're having these conversations, you know, and also, you know, I think that we all should be questioning, like, what are we doing here? You know, what are we doing here? You know, how is this going to change the world? You know, what's going on here? You know, and because that's actually what needs to happen, you know, and so who's training and educating and teaching, you know, so that people look at economics differently, you know, who's teaching, you know, how you look at, you know, restorative justice instead of punitive justice. Who's teaching how you look at, like, you know, the rights of Mother Earth versus the rights of corporations? Like, we need to be teaching that so that we can create those systems, because they need to be made, you know, and they need to be created, you know, and you know, either we create them or you wait for somebody else, but I'm tired of that, you know.
Thank you so much. And I just want to thank everyone involved for making this possible tonight. Suklima, Rosamund, Lawrence, Victoria, and especially Winona LaDuke. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming and participating. It was really, really rewarding, and I learned so much. So thank you, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Rich.